So what does a Middle Kingdom wisdom text have to do with the Exodus? Stay tuned and find out as I answer this question on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today we are answering a question that was asked by a viewer. Orthodox of the USA asks, what are your thoughts on how the Ipuwer papyrus relates to the book of Exodus? Orthodox of the USA, thank you very much for your question. Let's begin by describing the context of the Dialogue of Ipuwer versus the context of the Exodus. The Dialogue of Ipuwer was preserved in a single 19th dynasty papyrus, Papyrus Leiden 344, but is actually a much older text. Ipuwer comes out of a tradition of wisdom texts that were written in the 12th dynasty, Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Works similar to Ipuwer were produced at that same time as political propaganda during the Middle Kingdom, and they wrote these works to entrench reforms and bolster a kind of utopian thinking established by the apparatus of Middle Kingdom bureaucracy. Basically, what they were doing was saying the old regime was irresponsible, immoral, led to the decline of Egypt, but we're the new rulers and we're better. And how they expressed that they were better was by this creation of what's called ex eventu prophecy. Now, ex eventu prophecy essentially means after the event. As my producer has commented, it's a lot easier to write prophecy after the events and a lot easier to get it right. So essentially, these were basically prophecies written after the events that they were supposed to predict. And these prophecies showed how Asiatic Semites who were settling in the Nile Delta were a sign of the previous administration's moral weakness. But the new rulers of the Middle Kingdom were saving the day, re-establishing the natural order, suppressing those pesky Asiatics who were causing all the chaos and stealing natural resources from the native Egyptians. Okay, so in contrast to the Middle Kingdom and the setting of the Dialogue of Ipuwer, the Exodus takes place about 700 years after Ipuwer was written. If we look closely at the context of the events found in the book of Exodus, we find that the Exodus dates to the reign of Ramses II in the 13th century BC. Now, I won't get into how scholars have arrived at that date in this video, although I have no objection to doing so in a future video. However, I don't want to stray too far off topic. Suffice it to say that Ipuwer dates to roughly the 20th century BC, while the Exodus dates to the 13th century BC. And that's where things get interesting, because there are some provocative parallels between Ipuwer and the Exodus. Now, like other texts from this period, Ipuwer claims to be prophecy. Quote, "For what men of old foretold has come to fulfillment," end quote. Who were these men of old? Well, they were supposed to be scribes and magicians from the Old Kingdom who could peer into the future, were in touch with the gods, and could predict the fall of the Old Kingdom and the chaos that ensued in the first intermediate period. And Ipuwer describes a time when foreigners would overrun the Egyptian Nile Delta. Now, this relays the concerns the Egyptians had over Asiatic migration into the Delta, because at the end of the Old Kingdom, the Neolithic wet period, was ending, and nomadic tribes of Semites and Libyans that were wandering the savannas of the Sahara and the Sinai suddenly were without food. Now, climate change is not a new thing. This is probably one of the first major climate changes in recorded history. At the end of the Old Kingdom, much of the Sahara was still grassland. And the Sinai had olive trees and almond trees and acacia trees, and it was forested with grasslands. So there was a major environmental shift at the end of the Old Kingdom. And tribes used to wander the Sahara and the Sinai hunting food. Well, when all that grassland dried up, where did these tribes go? They went to the Nile Delta. Now, at this time, the Egyptians only sparsely inhabited the Nile Delta. But the Nile Delta served an important purpose for ancient Egypt. It was Egypt's larder. Should the rains not come in East Africa and the inundation not rise, there would have been famine. So the Egyptians depended on the delta for its hunting and fishing grounds to feed the people in the event of famine. With all these tribesmen from Libya and the Levant coming into the delta, that food supply, emergency food supply, was now threatened. But like other literature of this kind, and other literature includes the prophecy of Nefertiti and Jedi, Ipuwer describes the upending of society. Quote, "The Nile overflows, but no one tills the earth," end quote. That is to say, when the land is at its prime, the Nile overflows, and for the Egyptians, how high the Nile rose was directly proportional to what sort of crop you'd have. So if you had a little flood, you got a little crop. You got a big flood, you got a bumper crop. When the Nile overflows and the land is at its prime, but there's nobody there to till the land. This is sort of the upending of society that these prophecies predict, which is paupers become rich men, slaves become masters. The poor person who can't own a set of clothing now has royal robes. And Asiatics coming in and foreigners invading the land of Egypt is part of that upturning of society. Ipuwer also describes some disasters that seem to resonate with what is described in the book of Exodus. Particularly the statement, quote, "Truly the river is blood, but one drinks from it." Now, some have taken this as evidence of the Exodus, but I don't think this is direct evidence of the Exodus. It's more than that, and I'll get to what I mean. But there is a very interesting Exodus connection that we will see. Now, I want to talk about the river turning into blood, because that's very misunderstood. It's not both the book of Exodus and Ipuwer is not talking about the Nile River turning into a bright red color like newly flowing blood. It's talking about old, coagulated, black, oozing, clumpy blood. It's disgusting. And it's supposed to invoke that image of black ooziness. Blackish red, but not bright red. So that's what it means by the river turning to blood. Is it's turning black. Like an oil slick. It looks awful. Now, immediately, we all wanted to sort of jump to the idea of the river turning to blood as being the most interesting part of this Ipuwer passage. But I think there's a part of this that gets easily overlooked, which is even more interesting. The statement again is, truly the river is blood, but one drinks from it. It's that latter portion, that the one drinks from it, that I think is really interesting. And it's really unusual because many Egyptians didn't drink from the river. While 19th century Europeans waxed eloquent about the beauty of the Nile River is also Africa's toilet. The Nile River is teeming with corpses, deadly bacteria, viruses, and parasites, and drinking the Nile will make you very, very sick. In fact, it was noticed very early on that the Egyptians would drink first from well water, and those who drank from well water were healthier than those that drank from the river. And then those who drank, say, beer are healthier again than those who drank from well water. And we covered this in another video on beer making in ancient Egypt. So the ancient Egyptians purified their water by using well water and by making beer. So then what would compel them to start drinking from the Nile? Well, the answer is actually found in the book of Exodus, where we see that the water, even in the vessels, was contaminated with blood. Exodus 7:19. The vessels of stone and wood also contained blood. And by extension, so were all the batches of beer. Contaminated. This forced the Egyptians to start drinking water from the Nile itself. But there was another thing, which was the plague of hail also destroyed the barley crop. No barley, no beer, no water purification. Everyone would be drinking from the Nile, even though it was absolutely disgusting. And now everyone's also getting sick from the water, regardless of class. Now, by the time of Ramses II and the Exodus, the circumstances that had fueled the political theater of the Middle Kingdom had been long forgotten. So the original context of the ex eventu prophecies in Ipuwer had been forgotten. That bureaucracy no longer existed. That regime no longer existed. That whole sort of political theater no longer existed. But the texts were still in circulation. The texts survived. And the Egyptians started to treat these writings in terms of prophecies yet to be fulfilled, because they claimed to be prophecies yet to come. So they recontextualized these prophecies for new situations. So what we have is when Moses appeared, and with him plagues and events that turned the culture of Egypt on its head. It was no wonder that the Egyptians turned to these Middle Kingdom prophecies to help them make sense of what was happening. Overall, the Egyptians were not, say, as big on prophecy as the ancient Israelites. But what was happening to them seemed like the end of the world. But they didn't have the Book of Revelation. They had nothing like the Book of Revelation. But what they had was the Dialogue of Ipuwer, the prophecy of Nefertiti, and Jedi. Suddenly, everyone in the 19th dynasty was interested in these long-forgotten works. Works that were eerily similar to the events happening in the moment. But it wasn't just the Egyptians that were influenced by these works. Before Moses, the Israelites' only cultural reference to the divine was the stories of their ancestors who had encountered God, the theophanies. God appearing to Abraham, he appearing to Isaac, and appearing to Jacob. Moses was unprecedented in the Israelite religious experience. He was God's agent. He could predict the future. He could perform miracles. He could smite with divine power. Ipuwer and other Egyptian works introduced a new framework of divine spokesman to the Israelite experience. Middle Kingdom political theater spawned a new class of holy person in ancient Israel, the prophet. I hope this answered your question. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it informational and entertaining. See you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.